Hi everyone, this is chapter 2 from Reading Between the Signs. This is a very zoomed out introductory chapter about the general study of culture. The biggest takeaway from this chapter for me is that cultural understanding comes through an appreciation and an understanding of cultural differences. There tends to be a lot of focus on what makes us all the same, and that is a good and positive exercise. But an understanding of culture is being able to recognize where mine and yours could be different. This is a terrifyingly oversimplified definition of culture, a value system that knits together seemingly arbitrary behavior patterns. And this wheel at the bottom showcases just a few of the tenets that a culture can exemplify. Like I said, super oversimplified definition here. The book talks a little bit about what culture is and what culture is not, which can be helpful. A culture is a set of adaptations a group makes to help members in the future face challenges. I thought this was a really cool definition of what culture is. And another definition of what it is that it is a complex whole acquired as a member of a society. That whole quote is a little bit longer, but I think it's worth reading. That definition was written by what is considered the father of cultural anthropology, Edward B. Tyler, in 1871. That complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So, one of the earliest definitions was his, and I think it's a pretty good one. A few things that culture is not. Culture is not something that you can gain through education or by going to art museums or the opera. That's not what culture is. Culture is not something that you inherit biologically. It's not born inside your literal DNA. It's something that you acquire through the experience of growing up. And then culture is not your specific little individualized quirks, your specific way of pushing your glasses farther up your nose. That's not culture. That's just a personality thing. And of course, the cultural iceberg, we're all very familiar with it, but even the book talks and touches on this, that the parts that we can observe from a culture that is not ours is only 10%. Those are the observable things, what a culture eats or wears or how they worship or the way they talk. All those things that we can see is only 10%, which is shocking to think about. What I can observe is only 10% of a culture. What's beneath the water, what's the dangerous part, is the 90% of culture, the notions of a culture. And a notion can include how a culture perceives beauty, modesty, friendship, courtship, child raising, insanity, justice, leadership, and so many more. Those notions of different areas is what makes a culture what it is. And if you're not aware of, at least you don't know the 90%, you're definitely going to get a Titanic type situation here. All right, the book talks a lot about the history of cultural education. Everyone is raised in a culture. We learn that inherently. It's not something that we have to study, we just know what it is. But the study of culture is something different. Learning about a different culture has to be a bit more formal. Typically, cultural anthropology focuses on the culture in a vacuum and not how it interacts with other cultures, which is a weakness of the field, but that's the tend of cultural anthropology. So early cultural education was what the book calls the university model. This was used, you think back olden times, like Jane Austen novel type era, and it was reserved for people like diplomats who were going to other countries to establish trade relations, things like that. They were taught things like the geography of the land or the weather or agricultural exports, and not so much the like fine details, the day-to-day life of what culture looks like. So that was the university model, and that was what was used historically. Around 1950, in the 1950s, a different method of cultural education emerged called microcultural analysis. And this emerged because there was an obvious lack of truly understanding what a culture looks like in its day to day applications. What I truly need to know to be successful when visiting, when touching another culture. This was originally established primarily by the Foreign Service Institute, which was diplomacy. As countries started having these more formal relationships with each other more frequently and with even more countries than before, sending your diplomats to be fully educated was obviously a benefit for you. You wanted them to know how to respond to these other high ranking officials in the countries you were trying to set up relationships with. Also developed, this method was developed for business executives who would be sent overseas, again, to continue those trade relationships amongst private organizations. And there was a lot of business executives that were sent over with their families who burned out, for lack of a better term, and had to come back to the States. And they looked at why some people were successful over others, and it had to do with the understanding and the acceptance of the culture they were entering into. The microcultural analysis was also really beneficial when people from other countries started swapping countries for college courses, when other countries would come here to the US and vice versa, going overseas for your college education. Having an understanding of the culture where you were going to college, very important. The Peace Corps in the 50s, when that started up, really used this method because they found the university model lacking, since that's not what the people in the Peace Corps were actually going to be doing. They were in that grassroots day to day aspect, and they needed the more personalized, really applicable information to just live in a Tuesday that microcultural analysis could offer. Interestingly enough, the civil rights movement actually began using this method of cultural education and kind of helped start it because they were the message of the civil rights, one of the messages of the civil rights movement was to rebel against this idea of the melting pot. Oh, we all come together and then we all have to come out the same. It was really a rebellion against that idea. And so to preserve this mosaic, as they preferred, the mosaic of cultures in America, you had to understand them and what makes them special and unique more than just the agriculture and the geography like the university model taught. Okay, intercultural communication obviously is the big implication for interpreters. When communication between two different cultures happen, there's a lot of factors at play, one of which is called the proxemics, which is difficult for me to say, which includes the physical distance between two parties during a dialogue. What's the appropriate amount to stand away from each other or not stand away from each other? It also includes things like the design of public spaces. How are spaces designed so that people can be close together or farther apart for that comfort value? Other paralinguistic factors are things like intonation, rate of speech, volume. The use of silence actually comes up a lot, when it's appropriate to take 5 seconds before you answer, or other uses of silence. Kinestics, which again, hard for me to say, which is nonverbal behavior, not nonverbal behavior, nonverbal behavior, eye gaze, facial expressions, and gestures. These are things we're already familiar with as becoming sign language interpreters, but it applies to spoken language cultures as well, obviously. So models that can chart value differences. This is just one example of a way to chart a cultural value. It's developed by these two wonderful gentlemen, Kluckholm and Stotbeck. That's the best I can do. This is an example straight from the book, and this picture shows a continuum of where a culture can value nature. Now, you can replace nature with anything. How a culture values hot sauce here in Louisiana, how a culture values a two-parent household. You can replace the nature with anything. That's just the example from the book. So on one end, you have that a culture is completely in control of nature and we tell nature what to do and it bends to our will. And on the other end of that spectrum, you would have the people working their lives around nature and what's already established there. And then, of course, the variant grays in the middle. Intercultural perspectives is another way to view value models. So I have a cultural here and I have a culture here, and they each have different pitfalls that are no-nos or acceptables, and overlapping them can make it twice as hard to navigate. And that's where you get in the danger zone, those overlapping minefields, because my experience says this is okay, but your culture says it's not. So it just depends on how those overlapping minefields can or cannot make doing your job harder. Implications for interpreters, because at the end of the day, that's what this book is about. The author really encourages you to not just dismiss the frustration of, I don't know why they do that. I don't know why they're always 10 minutes late. I don't know why they're always 10 minutes early. Don't stop at your right to be personally offended or frustrated. Look deeper about what is causing that cultural mismatch, that expectation mismatch. Do the work. Appreciate that something else could be going on other than just your feelings got hurt. The author says that there are 2 steps to cultural mediation. One is identifying the differences that are going to happen. And then the second step is deciding which one's going to do the adjusting and how, which kind of stinks, but that seems like a good step 1, step 2 process that as interpreters, we're going to have to engage in a lot of ways. The book also talks about dispositions of a successful cultural mediator, things that you as a person can have that will make you more successful in mediating cultural events, not just communication events. They talk about flexibility, obviously, high levels of empathy, really being able to feel what your consumers could be feeling, a very high tolerance for ambiguity, which as interpreters, we're kind of already used to, and then the ability to communicate respect, because while landmines might be stepped on and culturally inappropriate things might be said from one culture to another, that's not always the intention of the speaker. So understanding how to convey the speaker's level of respect, regardless of the actual words that they used, can be really important for an interpreter. The book had a whole bunch of different examples throughout the chapter of different cultural contrasts to American culture that I thought were really interesting. So I just kind of wanted to put them on a slide at the end. So early in America's building of reservation homes for American Indians, Native Americans, was the first time a lot of these people had experienced bathrooms, toilets, receptacles inside their home. And originally they were very against that because their cultural perception was, why would you want to put that defiled waste under your roof? So just their perspective on it, how different that can be. With Arabs versus Americans, how physically close you are, they want to be really close. They literally want to be able to smell your breath. That's a form of their culture that helps them develop trust in another person. Whereas in America, obviously, I want to not be able to touch you if I reach out. Interestingly enough, both in Japanese culture and American Indians culture, Native American culture, is a very high value of silence. It shows respect and reverence, and that you're really thinking about the communication that's happening. In Greece, the A-OK handshake is not the A-OK handshake. It means you have a long anus. It is an insult. It's like worse than the middle finger, in my opinion. In Latinx cultures, widening your eyes is not surprise, like, oh, no way, it's help me, oh my gosh. It has a completely different meaning. The interpreter who wrote the book wrote about interpreting for a Filipino man who kept doing his eyebrows up and down. And she was like, was he flirting with me? But in his culture, that just indicates understanding. That's an act of listening, back channeling response instead of just this. It's, which we kind of see as a flirtatious thing. Another example the book writes about is an Ethiopian woman at a pool being complimented about how skinny she is. And the woman is just petrified because her culture values larger women. So she feels that it's more an insult on her, not understanding the cultural difference there. And then, of course, there's a million differences between deaf and hearing culture that the whole book details. But one of the ones in this chapter was a instance that happened to the author. She was at a conference. There was a deaf presenter with voicing interpreters. So she was listening to one of the people that she knew voice interpreting while looking at something else. And another deaf attendant approached her about how they felt that was rude. That yes, you can access the information auditorily, but to show respect, you should keep your eyes on the signing presenter at all times. That's just a fun list, in my opinion, of different cultural difference examples.